So I think we'll get started with this next section now, just to kind of make sure we don't fall back on time. So most people are probably familiar with Skyline. Obviously, you've been using Skyline too, but most people are probably familiar before coming here with Skyline. But a number of years ago, we started to see that people were storing their Skyline documents all over the place. Would have different directory structures on their computer. They had no real way of sharing the Skyline documents with either even within their lab, let alone between different labs. And we began to think, well, this all should be incorporated or encapsulated into some sort of relational database. It should be searchable, it should be queryable. You should be able to find your documents, version control them. It seemed to make a lot of sense. When you start to think about how would you build a relational database server to manage all of this, one of the things we began to think about is like security of the server, APIs. It began to be kind of a daunting type of idea of what we could do with kind of an academic lab resources on a relatively small project. And this is where we decided that we would build this Panorama, which is a module within Labkey Server, and it's built on top of this existing framework that had things like security, a well-established API. And so if you're going to build a house, you want to make sure you put it on a solid foundation. And this was basically the idea, is that we build this on top of this Labkey server. So we partnered with Labkey. This is definitely a very collaborative effort between our lab, Geisha Sharma, handling this from our lab perspective, and then Josh Eckels is managing the effort from Labkey. And this has been a very productive project. And I hope what comes about this is people begin to realize and start to think about how they could actually use Panorama within your lab or within your company, or in a way that which you could manage documents, share documents, and just come up with different ways even for doing analyses as well. It's a very flexible framework. Anyway, Josh Eckels is the Vice President of Engineering for Labkey, and we'll tell you a little bit about Panorama.
All right, thanks, Mike. So maybe I can get a quick show of hands. Who, before maybe getting an email with a link to an account in the past couple of days, had heard of Panorama before coming here? All right, cool. And had any of you actually used it a little bit? And what for? Were you uploading data, pulling public data sets? What kind of stuff? For QC? Great. Okay, cool. Anybody do anything else with it so far? Those are two great kind of usage scenarios, and we'll kind of talk more about those and some other ones that might be of interest to you as well. So like Mike said, basically this kind of trailed the development of Skyline by a few years. And the way that we kind of think about it is it's a way to help organize this mountain of data that you're going to be generating as you start cranking up with Skyline and creating lots of documents, analyzing lots of samples, wanting to analyze across all of those, or just kind of go back and say, wait, didn't I set up a method for this peptide before? Where was that? And so this is a web-based complement to Skyline itself. You think of it as kind of a data repository. You can put all your data in there. You can organize it in different ways. You can share it with folks internal to your lab, external collaborators, make it public. You can kind of choose who gets to do what. So it's reasonably mature at this point. So we're about 6 years in. Like I said, about 4 years behind Skyline in terms of the initial release. And as Mike mentioned, this is a joint development effort. So we at Labkey have been doing something called Labkey Server for about 15 years or so. This is a module within that, a little bit more on that in a sec. And so we're co-developing that with the McCoss lab. So we're kind of both taking features depending on what's going to be the most efficient way to get it in there. And we're always trying to stay current with both Skyline, the main release, and Skyline Daily. So we're kind of generally leapfrogging each other a little bit, trying to make sure that as Skyline adds a new feature, we're supporting that in Panorama and vice versa. And it is web-based, and you can either have your own in-house install, and I know that's of particular interest to pharma and biotech companies that have IP concerns about their data leaving their own network, or you can have it hosted either by Labkey or using a great shared installation that the Cost Lab hosts for the community as a whole, called Panorama Web, and you'll be seeing a lot more in depth on that particular installation in a little bit. So real brief Labkey Server overview. So this is a system that's, like I said, about 15 years old. It came out of more of a protein database search style of mass spec proteomics. And then we've expanded it to support a bunch of other types of assays, plate-based assays, flow cytometry, sequencing, etc., as well as a lot of metadata tracking. So this is, what a lot of groups find kind of exciting about it is, you can have your analysis results, or your raw data, but then actually connect that back with sample information, with patient or animal or cell line, or other types of data. It's got a handful of collaboration tools, and I think Geisha will be highlighting some of those. And Panorama fits into that overall framework quite well. So the overall kind of life cycle of using Skyline and Panorama together is that generally you're always starting with Skyline, or someone has started with Skyline, and then you can piggyback on the work that they've already done. So in our little diagram here, we've got, let's see, I think I've got a pointer of sorts. Yeah. Over here, we've got the instrument generating our data. Producing raw files of various formats, slurping those into Skyline, and then uploading that into the Panorama web server up here. And so you have a variety of users interacting with that in the web interface, and this is sometimes a nice way to share data with someone who wants to see some of the detail but doesn't know anything about Skyline. You haven't conned them into coming to the next version of this class. So they can just log in and, you just send them a link, and you can always download the file back into Skyline and kind of iterate on it. We always want to have kind of that full fidelity where we're allowing you to get back to the primary data within Skyline. And then you can see over here, we've got a little bit of kind of a bypass. So, one of the things that was mentioned earlier is the QC workflow. And so we've wanted to make that as easy and automated as possible, doing system suitability type workflows. And so AutoQC is a way essentially to run Skyline in what we call a headless mode, where you don't actually have to open up Skyline and drag in some new files. It will just analyze them automatically, kind of running in the background, and then push that into Panorama. And so there's a variety of other scenarios you can use Skyline for in that command line mode. So if you are looking to do kind of an automated workflow, you've got a high volume of samples that you want to have consistent analysis on, you can set up a pipeline using a scripting tool or the like to run a bunch of data through Skyline without having to manually interact with it. And you see down here, we've also got some icons representing being able to pull that data back out. So a lot of people don't necessarily want to hand off data to a biologist that's in a Skyline format. They want to give them an Excel file or the like. Skyline's got a bunch of great built-in tools, but Panorama lets you go directly from what's been imported into the web server as well. And you can also connect through R or Perl or Python or other analysis tools and be able to pull data directly from Panorama. So whatever the latest data is, have access to that in a consistent format. Please jump in at any point if folks have questions as I go. So I think we got some examples from some people just a minute ago on these first two types of usage. So what we've tried to do within Panorama is to set things up so that there's some consistent workflows and consistent user interfaces that are kind of designed around a given purpose. And so when you create a folder within Panorama, which is kind of the organizational unit, kind of like a folder on your desktop, you get to choose which of these modes you want to be working in. I think Geisha will be showing some examples of this in the hands-on session. But the first is kind of the general purpose repositories, just a place to put your Skyline files instead of putting them in Dropbox or an FTP server or emailing them around or those types of things. So a place that actually knows something about the fact that they are Skyline files instead of it's just a generic file that happens to be containing Skyline data. And it's also a place to be able to track multiple versions of files. Or to be able to search over all of that data that you've imported. The second example here, and this is really a spot where people have kind of jumped in and starting to use Panorama, and even if Skyline isn't their primary analysis tool, they found that being able to do the system suitability style workflows using Panorama to check the longitudinal performance of the instrumentation has really been kind of a great way to make sure they do that consistently and that they're able to very quickly identify problems where something pops up and not run the much more valuable experimental samples through the instrument that's not performing well. And this third category, the chromatogram library, is something that we actually put in very early in Panorama and was kind of, I don't know, maybe late in for a while, and then we seem to be getting some kind of renewed interest in it. So a chromatogram library, for those who haven't worked with it, is kind of the MS1 version of a spectral library. So you can essentially curate this set of Skyline data for a given instrument and a given species, for example, to kind of produce the canonical version of a chromatogram that you can then use to score future samples against in Skyline as a way to kind of allow that initial setup to inform your downstream analysis. And then diving deeper into the individual folder types. So experimental data folders, that first one, it's a secure place to be able to stash your Skyline data after you've generated it. So you can see a lot of the screenshots here look pretty similar to things that you're probably familiar with or becoming familiar with in Skyline. We're not necessarily trying to duplicate every single report or plot that Skyline can produce, and vice versa. There's some things right now that Panorama does that Skyline doesn't have built in, but we're trying to get the majority of things that people are using frequently, so that you don't have to go back into Skyline to reopen and to reanalyze. One thing that's important to kind of understand about the workflow is that Panorama is essentially a read-only copy of that data. So if you, for example, open up a chromatogram and you say, oh, I don't like that peak, I think Skyline chose the wrong boundaries for it. The process to correct that is to pull that back into Skyline, make the adjustment there, and then you can upload a new version of that file into Panorama. But Panorama is not allowing you to kind of make those edits. We're using Skyline as the sole tool for that. And once you've imported that data, you can go ahead and search across it. So there's some built-in search features, and then we have the APIs as a way to kind of do more advanced searches on top of that. This is a way to say, across all my Skyline files that I've ever created and imported into Panorama, which are the ones that were analyzing peptide X or had protein Y in them. And we can organize our data into different kind of projects or folders, so that for say a particular grant that you're working on, maybe you have a separate folder per person in the lab within that, or based on the organism that you're studying. So there's a bunch of different ways you can kind of slice and dice that data to be able to both have it organized in the first place, but then still be able to query across everything that you've done across those different studies. The version tracking is something that we're really kind of building on, made some significant improvements on the last year, and we think is a significant priority for us in the next 12 months or so. And so, the idea here is that you may be doing a variety of different workflows where you are iterating over a particular Skyline file. So one scenario might be that you're setting up a method build. and you're really trying to narrow, what are the best performing peptides, best performing transition, best performing small molecules for a particular analysis. And so you might start with a very large set that you've got 100 peptides or 1,000 peptides, and you're trying to curate which are the ones that I really want to be using for my analysis. And so then as you winnow that down to the working set that you're going to be using going forward, you can be keeping track of what all those different subsets that you're building are, and be kind of adding notes to, okay, here's why I went from this initial set of 500 to this kind of final set of 200, and the various steps along the way. And that can be really useful for auditing purposes. So we're looking to kind of tighten up some of those things and integrate it even more into Skyline and how it works. We will automatically connect different versions of a given document. So every time you push from Skyline, and you'll see what that looks like a little bit, we'll automatically link those versions together, so you don't have to kind of do a manual connection between them. And we're doing more kind of building tools to be able to compare version 1 with version 10 on those, so you can kind of see easily at a glance what's changed. And then also in the next 6 to 12 months, we're going to be looking for ways to just reduce the amount of data transfer between the two sides, being able to only push the smaller set of data that's actually changed between those versions, just to make it an even tighter iterative loop. Quantitation and calibration curves. So this kind of, some people tend to talk about this as kind of a separate workflow, but I think of it more as part of this general experimental data folder. So it's relatively new. It's about a year old within Panorama. So it follows a little bit behind Skyline's support for that, which I think was maybe a year earlier. And I think you guys haven't done this as part of the course yet, right? Kind of calibration curves, absolute quantitation. Okay. So essentially what you can do within Skyline is set up a curve where you have known concentrations of a given analyte across multiple samples, create the curve, and then plot your unknowns against that. So Panorama will kind of piggyback on that. Skyline is the place again where you kind of set that up and edit it and get it set up for the analysis. And then you can import into Panorama. We'll pull that in. You can interact with these plots, click on points, and so forth. And then in the past a couple of releases, we've added support for more advanced reporting on top of that. So figures of merit. This is a case where we did kind of an initial version in Panorama based on input from some collaborators, and then that got folded back into Skyline, and we're adding more capabilities to the Panorama side to be able to do limits of detection, limits of quantitation, and be able to configure kind of what are your criteria for setting those limits in terms of percent bias, percent CV, and so forth. And then we're also doing a variety of kind of time-based support for reporting on these. So pharmacokinetics, I think we're going to be doing very shortly pharmacodynamics as well, where essentially what you've done in Skyline is you set up multiple replicates representing your different time points, and then Panorama will go ahead and plot those for you and do all the standard PK calculations and allow you to interact with what are your kind of initial and terminal, the C0 and terminal time points for those calculations. So then going to the next kind of major category of use, these quality control folders. So I'm sure Lindsay will probably start her slide by correcting that as a name. So we tend to kind of just refer to it as QC, but really it's about kind of system suitability a lot of the time. And so we're monitoring the instrument, or the chromatography before the mass spec itself, monitoring its performance over time. So we have a variety of different metrics that you can track. So that's things like retention time or peak width or peak area. We can do the ratio between the peptide and the transition areas to kind of see if we're getting significant fall off or change there. And we can essentially for a handful of configured analytes, so that's either peptides or small molecules, monitor their performance over time. So generally what we've designed this for is a relatively small number of peptides or small molecules that you're analyzing. So most of the groups that we're working with are kind of in the 10 to 20 range, as opposed to trying to track hundreds or thousands, just because you're going to get at least some false positives in terms of outliers if you're looking at such a wide sample set. So essentially a well-curated, very stable, very predictable set of analytes that you're looking at. A lot of people will use, for example, a set of IRT peptides or some other very standard sample that they can just run over and over. And then we can establish normal ranges, which is kind of these shaded plots, or shaded area of the plot rather, where you can say, okay, I've got some period of stable performance. I'm pretty happy with how this is looking. And then you can monitor that, look for outliers, and then if you notice a significant change in performance, okay, you need to intervene, like something's gone wrong with the instrumentation, and then you can maybe establish a new normal range going forward. So there'll be much more detail on this in, I think not the following, but the kind of mid-afternoon presentation today. And then what we wanted to do is make this as automatic as we could. So, we've heard from a lot of groups. Yep, absolutely. Critical will be doing the QC and system suitability checks, but they don't really want to spend much time doing it. And so Vigacia created this great tool called AutoQC, which is in the screenshot here. So this is that separate utility that's running and kind of doing the bypass route on the workflow diagram. Essentially, what you do is you define a Skyline document with things that you want to be monitoring in terms of peptides, small molecules, transitions, etc. You tell AutoQC where to look for newly acquired sample files rolling off the instrument, and then you just let it run in the background, and it will detect new file coming in, analyze it, and within, a minute in most cases, because they tend to be pretty small. So some things that you're looking at, like I mentioned, that gets imported into Panorama, and you've got new data points on your longitudinal plot. And then what we found is that as groups set that up and started acquiring lots of data, we needed better ways to summarize it. So we created some of these dashboard views so that you can monitor individual instruments and kind of see how they're doing, because if you've got a number of instruments in your lab or in your core, you probably don't want to have all that data commingled. You want to be looking at, okay, how's the QTOF doing, or looking at them individually. So we have the summary reports where you can see something is red and angry up in this top one, and these others are looking happy at the moment. Again, we'll be looking at more details with specific examples a little bit later this afternoon. And then one of the main scenarios, like Mike said, around Panorama is being able to share that data. So it's not just a Skyline document that you've got on your hard drive or on your USB flash drive or the like. It's something that you can give other people access to in limited ways, or give them full control. So you can say, okay, I want collaborator from another lab to have read access to this particular folder within Panorama, or I want someone that's working at the bench next to me. They're a full-on editor, and then maybe there's someone in the lab who's the admin who sets up new folders, or is responsible for adding users or deleting users if they leave the lab. And then kind of the last point, if your server is in a place where other groups can get to it, it's not behind a corporate firewall or the like. You can choose to make that data fully public. And so on the server that the Eckels Lab hosts, that Panorama Web, you can either just make an individual folder public and say, hey, everyone can get at this, or we get you to set up kind of a full workflow to make it part of Panorama Public, which is a way to essentially make it part of the official supporting data, kind of supplemental data for publication. There's a whole workflow in there on giving reviewers access to it before it becomes fully public, and then kind of flipping it over into kind of post-publication mode. So I mentioned before, related to the diagram, that being able to do reporting and APIs is really a critical aspect to a lot of groups, especially as they are moving to higher volumes of samples and want to be able to do kind of these cross-project analyses. And so integration with things like R has been really critical to enable that. So very similar to how Skyline allows you to plug in an external tool and be able to run R scripts over the data in that one Skyline document. Panorama lets you download an R package. It's called R Labkey that you get through CRAN, which is the standard R kind of module distribution system, and allows you to connect to that data in Panorama and pull it. So anytime you're looking at data in Panorama, you can click on a button to say export an R script. It's going to give you within R the same data that you're looking at inside Panorama. And we've got kind of similar options for Perl and Python and other languages if you're not doing R yourself. And then we have the ability to just within Panorama write queries using SQL for those who are familiar with relational databases already as a way to kind of report and aggregate over that data. Or you can do just plotting and charting, bar plots, line plots, box plots, etc. Within Panorama without having to write any script at all. So hopefully that gave you a little kind of overview of the tools that are available. So I think next steps will be much more concrete as soon as Vigisha takes over. But Panorama Web is really kind of where I recommend people explore and kick the tires. So you both see the data that's already there. There's an example project of just kind of an assortment of different files that have been uploaded. There's also a lot of great data in Panorama Public, which is kind of more curated and there's more context around it. And it's a place where you can upload your own data and kind of start playing around with what that looks like in that full workflow. And then if you're interested and like what you see, want to make folks aware that there is something that we call the Panorama Partners Program. Basically, it's a way for you and your group to get support and input and training from the Eckels Lab directly, as well as us from Labkey. So kind of gives you a more official vote in terms of setting the future priorities for the things that we're adding. So we're definitely interested in input from everyone on what's working well for them, what the gaps might be, what things we should be looking to add. But this kind of gives you a little extra boost in terms of setting those priorities. And really, a lot of the folks that have joined Panorama Partners, a lot of the organizations have been the companies that want to have their own in-house installation and want to have assistance in running that, making sure it's maintained and upgraded and so forth. So there's a number of pharma companies where we're kind of actively collaborating, and they've contributed a bunch of the ideas for the new features that we've added since the initial rollout.